With funding flowing again and African startups making bold cross-border acquisitions, is this the new start of a new global era for African tech? Good morning and welcome to another power-packed episode of Business Week. This week, Senegal's domestic bond raise is oversubscribed despite debt concerns, and Nigeria's oil output is finally hitting its OPEC quota of 1.5 million barrels a day. Meanwhile, Nigeria's Abia state has secured over $260 million in DFI funding for critical infrastructure, and Chevron is closing its landmark acquisition of Hess Corporation after muscling out ExxonMobil in the Guyana oil saga. In Asia, China's exports and GDP data show resilience in the face of global uncertainty, while back home here in Nigeria, Tinubu's 150 billion naira Southeast Investment Company aims to turbocharge regional industrialization. And later on, we deep dive into how African fintechs are rebounding from a funding winter, raising over $1.3 billion in the first half of 2025 and making bold cross-border acquisitions. Well, if you missed the big business stories of the week, don't worry, I'm here to help you catch up as always. I'm Rolake Akikugbe-Filani. Stay tuned. As always, I like to start with taking a look at global energy commodities. Brent and WTI crude from North America are down week on week by over 1% respectively. I mean, key factor here is really OPEC's announcement last weekend, if you followed our news here on Business Week, that it was going to release more than 500,000 barrels a day of additional production into the market. And this has sort of offset fears of sanctions, I guess, new EU sanctions against Iraq, new US sanctions against Iraq. Building refined product inventories as well in the North American market did contribute to that downward trend week on week, although we did see a rise on Brent and WTI from Thursday to Friday of this past week. Natural gas is up by 6.25% week on week, and RBOB gasoline is down by 1.83%. Let's take a look at equities markets, starting, of course, here with Nigeria. Nothing much majorly here to report, apart from the fact that the number of deals from the previous Friday did tank by over 14%. So that was an interesting development, although the volume of shares traded did come up as well. And the value of shares traded was up by 104%, with equity capitalization now over 80 trillion naira. What is accounting for the strong, at least year-on-year performance on the Nigeria Stock Exchange? We'll be talking about that a bit later in the show. Let's take a look at African equities markets here. Johannesburg and Casablanca were the two best performing markets week on week of the ones that we do show. Accra and Nairobi were both down by almost 1% respectively. Let's take a look at American stocks. Well, it was a fairly good end note for markets trading on Wall Street. Mixed economic data coming out of the US market. Of course, tariff tension still in the air. Notwithstanding, it was a pretty good week, especially for the NASDAQ Composite Index, which ended the trading week up by 1.43%. Now to my top picks from around the world. The first news here is that Senegal has raised a domestic bond, about $644 million in domestic bond issuances, and this comes despite the fact that S&P Global Ratings Agency just downgraded Senegal over its debt levels. Actually, debt to GDP in Senegal is currently at 120%. Now, interesting development late last year in Senegal when the new government discovered that there was $14 billion of debt that had not been previously revealed. That did contribute to those debt levels. The issuance was oversubscribed on this domestic bond by about 16% or thereabouts, showing strong domestic investor sentiment and perhaps confidence in the government's economic reform path. The country is also trying to rebase its GDP. Now, the rebasing of that GDP could obviously will reduce the debt to GDP ratio levels, maybe bring it closer to 100% or below. And the government is also saying that it could also see a 15 to 25% boost in the country's GDP with that rebasing. So that is actually a story one would really love to track. But congrats to the government of Senegal on that domestic issuance. Now, this is a very important subnational story. We don't often get these types of stories, but Abia State in southeastern Nigeria has secured $263.8 million in funding under the Abia State Integrated Infrastructure Development Project. Now, that money has been secured from the Africa Development Bank, the Islamic Development Bank, the federal government of Nigeria. The Africa Development Bank is giving out a little over $100 million. The Islamic Development Bank is doing about $125 million, and the federal government of Nigeria will be contributing about $24 million to infrastructure projects, from waste management to renewables to roads. There's also a plan to build and restore around over 200 kilometers of roads within the state. This is a major boost to the state government of Dr. Alex Otti, who took power in elections around 2 years ago. So Abia State actually may be perhaps marking a return to subnational borrowing for development within Nigeria. We'll see. But this is really great news, and I felt it was really worth reporting. Chevron has sealed a $55 billion acquisition of U.S. independent Hess Corporation in Guyana, the South American country of Guyana. Now, the big thing here is that Chevron, ExxonMobil, and CNOOC, the Chinese national oil company, were all partners on the Straybuck oil field. And this was a high-stakes dispute because both Exxon and CNOOC had taken Chevron to the International Chamber of Commerce in arbitration, claiming that they had preemptive rights to buy the stake that was being sold by Hess Corporation, one of the top performing American independents in the global oil and gas market. Now, Chevron has won that arbitration and is set to tap into an estimated 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent in recoverable resources from the Straybuck field. Now, 11 billion barrels of oil equivalent for Chevron, which has seen its reserves deplete to around 9 billion barrels of oil equivalent, is a major boost to the company, right? So Chevron has won that International Chamber of Commerce arbitration. There is no further room for appeal. ExxonMobil and CNOOC have said, okay, fine, we're good to go. Chevron also says that the integration of both companies, itself and Hess, in that merger, which also passed all the antitrust guidelines, will begin in earnest, and staff are very welcome to opt for several severance packages if they wish. So that is a major oil and gas M&A story coming out of global markets. Wetlands losses could cost the global economy $39 trillion. Now, wetlands are essentially petlands or floodplains around the world. And since 1970, according to a report by the Wetlands Conservation Organization, a global wetlands conservation organization, the world has lost 22% of wetlands since 1970. And just to put this in perspective, that is equivalent to around 411 million hectares of land, which is about 500 million. We're told 500 million football pitches. Now, just let that sink in for a second. Wetlands are an important part of the global ecosystem for the natural environment, and of course, also help with things like aquaculture, carbon storage, and whatnot. Of course, climate change is a factor here. But of course, the Wetlands Conservation Organization, is warning that this could lead to major economic losses if not addressed. And interestingly, wetlands constitute only 6% of the Earth's total surface. And finally, Nigeria has met its OPEC quota. According to data released from NURPC in June, the Nigeria Upstream Petroleum Regulatory Commission, the upstream regulator, Nigeria produced 1.5 million barrels of oil in June, 1.505 million barrels of oil in June, compared to its OPEC quota of 1.5. So that's about 104% over the OPEC quota. Now, the Combined crude and condensate production for June was about 1.6, with condensate accounting for around 191,000 barrels a day. So the combined liquids production outlook or status for June was about 1.69 million barrels. So this great thing for Nigeria, but it will obviously have to negotiate how it engages on the OPEC quota front because it wants to increase that quota by 2027. Now, this is the first time since January 2025 that crude oil production, not liquids combined with condensate, that crude oil production has reached 1.5 million barrels. The last time was in January. Good news for Nigeria. Let's hope that trajectory continues and is sustained or ramped up. That's it for my top picks from around the world. Now for some other top stories from around the world. First, China's export growth outpaced expectations in June, lifted by strong demand from non-US markets and a temporary pause in American tariffs that slowed declines in US-bound shipments. Exports surged 5.8% in June year-on-year in US dollar terms, according to customs data released on Monday, outperforming Reuters' forecast of a 5% increase. Still on China, Chinese electric vehicle makers are rapidly claiming ground in Norway, one of the world's most EV-friendly nations, shaking up a market long dominated by Tesla and Western auto brands. Since the first MG delivery in January 2020, Chinese EVs have captured nearly 10% of Norway's market thanks to aggressive pricing, cutting-edge tech, and the absence of import tariffs, giving Beijing's automakers a strategic edge. TSMC posted a blockbuster 61% year-on-year jump in second quarter profit driven by sustained demand for AI chips and advanced semiconductors. The chip giant expects Q3 revenues to hit between $31.8 billion and $33 billion, with full-year sales projected to rise 30% in USD terms. The company CEO Wei cited growing AI momentum as the key tailwind. Now to the US. US President Donald Trump has threatened to slap a 30% tariff on imports from Mexico and the EU by the 1st of August, intensifying a high-stakes standoff with major US trading partners. The warning, posted Saturday on Trump's Truth Social account, followed failed negotiations and was addressed to both the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. U.S. consumer prices crept up in June as President Trump's new tariffs began filtering through the economy, raising inflationary pressure. The consumer price index rose 0.3% for the month, pushing the annual inflation rate to 2.7% per Tuesday's Bureau of Labor Statistics report. That's the highest since February and still above the Fed's 2% comfort zone. Now, over to the UK. Let's see. UK inflation came in hotter than expected in June, raising questions about the Bank of England's next policy move. Annual inflation hit 3.6% in June, up from 3.4% in May, exceeding economists' expectations. Core inflation, excluding volatile items, also ticked higher to 3.7%. Now to Africa. Côte d'Ivoire has entered the samurai bond market for the first time, raising 50 billion yen or $330 million as it looks to diversify funding sources. The 10-year bond, issued at a 2.3% coupon, makes the world's top cocoa exporter the only sub-Saharan African sovereign currently active in the Japanese bond market. That's according to the Finance Ministry. Still on sub-Saharan Africa, Uganda's foreign exchange reserves have jumped by over a third year-on-year, hitting $4.3 billion in June and reversing earlier declines flagged by the central bank. Finance Ministry Permanent Secretary Ramathan Gubi said the reserve level now covers 3.8 months of imports, up from $3.2 billion a year ago, helped in part by the central bank's increased forex purchases. And in good news for Nigeria, Nigeria's inflation eased for the third straight month in June, clocking in at 22.22% year-on-year and providing some relief ahead of the MPC's next rate-setting meeting. The NBS reported a drop from 22.97% in May, with analysts watching closely to see if the central bank will respond by holding or cutting rates in its upcoming decision. President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has greenlit the creation of the Southeast Investment Company, a federally backed vehicle set to accelerate industrial growth in the region with 150 billion naira capital base. Announced Friday, the company will operate under the Southeast Development Commission and aims to crowd in private capital to drive inclusive growth, infrastructure, and economic transformation across Nigeria's southeast. And finally, Nigeria's data consumption hit a record 1.04 million terabytes in May 2025, even as internet subscriptions fell, pointing to higher per-user demand. According to NCC data, this marks the highest usage level since the regulator began publishing records in January 2023, surpassing the previous high of 1 million terabytes recorded earlier this year in January. Well, that's it for our top stories.